The silver research ship moved through space like a giant metal whale, its hull gleaming under the distant light of an alien sun. Inside the ship, Chief Xenobiologist HFY walked through the sterile white corridors with careful steps. His long gray fingers held a data tablet that showed readings from his latest collection of specimens. The Zephyrians had been doing this work for thousands of years, traveling from world to world, to gather samples of life before those species disappeared forever. HFY stopped at the observation deck and looked down at the holding chambers below. 12 energy cages hummed quietly in the large room, each one containing what the Zephyrians believed were primitive creatures from the third planet of a small solar system the collection team had called the world Earth, and these specimens were supposedly the most vulnerable members of their species. The creatures were small, much smaller than adult Zephyrians with soft pale or dark skin and thick hair on their heads. They made constant noise, high-pitched sounds that the ship's computers could not translate into meaningful language. The Zephyrians had decided these were simply distress calls, like the sounds made by frightened animals. In cage number 3, a small creature with brown hair and dark eyes sat in the corner, holding an even smaller one against his chest. The larger one was making soft sounds, moving his hand over the smaller one's head in repeated motions. HFY noted this behavior in his tablet, marking it as possible grooming activity similar to what they had observed in lower mammals. The specimen in cage number 3 was Jake Martinez, though the Zephyrians had no interest in learning his name. He was 12 years old and trying his best to comfort his 7-year-old sister Lucy, who had not stopped crying since they woke up in this strange place. Jake did not understand where they were or what had happened to them, but he knew he had to take care of Lucy no matter what. In the cage next to them, a small girl with blonde hair sat by herself, singing quietly. Katie Adams was 10 years old and had been taken from her backyard while playing with her dog. The dog was not here, and Katie kept looking around hoping to see him. She sang the songs her mother used to sing to her when she was scared, not knowing that the aliens above were recording every sound she made. Across the room, 8-year-old Ben Cooper lay on the cold floor of his cage, shivering and pale. He had not eaten the strange food the aliens gave them, and his small body was getting weaker by the hour. The other children could see him through their energy barriers, and they called out to him, trying to get him to drink the water that tasted wrong but was the only liquid they had. Captain Mordak entered the observation deck, his tall frame casting a shadow over HFY's workstation. The Zephyrian captain had led many collection missions over his long career, but there was something different about these specimens that made him curious. They showed behaviors that seemed more complex than their size and apparent age would suggest. "What have you learned from the Earth specimens?" Mordak asked, his voice flat and emotionless as all Zephyrian voices were. HFY looked at his data tablet and began reading his notes. The specimens display unusual social bonding behaviors. They attempt to communicate not only with us but with each other across the barriers of their containment units. The larger specimens appear to show protective responses toward the smaller ones, even though they are not related by our scans. Protective responses in captured specimens is not uncommon, Mordak replied. Many species show pack behaviors when stressed. Yes, but these specimens show more than simple pack behavior. They appear to be organizing themselves into a social structure within their containment area. The largest specimen in cage 3 has established himself as a leader figure, directing the others in activities such as food distribution and rest periods. Below them, Jake had indeed taken charge of the children as much as he could from inside his energy cage. He had figured out the timing of when the aliens brought food, and he made sure everyone knew to save some water for Ben, who was getting sicker. Jake had also worked out a system where the older kids would take turns staying awake to watch over the younger ones while they slept. Dr. Veltana, the ship's behavioral specialist, joined them at the observation window. Her large black eyes studied the specimens with scientific interest. "I have been monitoring their emotional responses," she said. "The readings are quite remarkable. Despite their situation, they maintain what can only be described as hope. This is extremely unusual in captured specimens." "Hope?" Captain Mordak questioned. "You believe these creatures understand their situation well enough to have hope?" The brain scans show complex emotional patterns. They are not simply reacting to immediate stimuli like basic animals would. They appear to be planning anticipating and maintaining belief in future positive outcomes despite their current circumstances. In cage number 7, 9-year-old Danny Kim sat cross-legged, using his finger to draw patterns on the floor of his cage. He had been trying to figure out how the energy barriers worked, watching carefully every time the aliens came near. Danny was good at math and puzzles, and he was treating this like the biggest puzzle he had ever seen. The aliens watched Danny's activities and recorded them as repetitive motor behaviors consistent with stress, responses in lower mammals. They had no idea that Danny was actually mapping the power fluctuations in the barrier system and had already identified what he thought might be a weakness in the energy field's lower left corner. Lucy Martinez had stopped crying and was now singing softly to herself, the same lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her in Spanish. The alien computers recorded it as repetitive vocalizations of unknown purpose, but to the other children, it was a comfort that reminded them of home. 11-year-old Amy Chen had organized a game with the other children where they would tap on their cage walls in patterns, creating rhythms that traveled from one cage to another. The aliens recorded this as territorial marking behavior, not understanding that Amy was actually teaching the younger children a way to communicate that made them feel less alone. Kethavar made more notes on his tablet. I recommend we extend the observation period. These specimens are providing data that contradicts many of our assumptions about primitive species. Their social behaviors are more sophisticated than we initially calculated. Agreed, said Captain Mordak. Prepare a preliminary report for transmission to the homeworld. Include your recommendations for extended study. Dr. Veltana nodded. I will continue monitoring their emotional states. If these readings are accurate, we may need to revise our classification system for primitive species. The 3 Zephyrians left the observation deck, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Below them, 12 human children continued to hope, to plan, and to take care of each other in ways that their captors could observe but not understand. Jake Martinez held his sister closer and whispered promises that their parents would find them, not knowing that his words were being recorded and filed away as meaningless vocalizations. The ship continued its slow journey toward the outer edge of the solar system, carrying its precious cargo of specimens that the Zephyrians believed were nothing more than interesting animals. They had no concept of what they had really taken, or what was coming for them. Maria Martinez stood in her kitchen, her hands shaking as she held the phone to her ear. The police officer on the other end was asking her to describe what Jake and Lucy were wearing when she last saw them, but the words felt like they were coming from very far away. Her children had been playing in the backyard after dinner, and when she went to call them in for baths, they were simply gone. The backyard gate was still locked. There were no footprints in the soft dirt around the fence. No signs of a struggle, no broken toys or torn clothing. Jake and Lucy Martinez had vanished as if they had never been there at all. 3 states away, Carol Cooper was having the same terrible conversation with a different police officer. Her son Ben had been walking to his friend's house just 2 blocks away, a trip he had made hundreds of times before. The friend's mother had called when Ben never arrived, and now nobody could find any trace of the 8-year-old boy anywhere. In Oregon, Robert Adams paced back and forth in his living room, while his wife Nancy sat on the couch, clutching Katie's favorite stuffed animal. Katie had been in their fenced backyard playing with their dog Max when she disappeared. Max had been found hours later, whimpering by the back door, but Katie was nowhere to be found. The disappearances had happened within hours of each other across different states, but at first, nobody connected them. Local police departments worked their individual cases, following the usual procedures for missing children. They checked with family members and friends, searched nearby woods and parks, and put out alerts on local news stations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was working late in her office at NASA when the call came in. Elena specialized in atmospheric disturbances and unusual energy readings, and the FBI had learned to contact her when they found strange evidence at crime scenes. The agent on the phone explained that they had found something unusual at several missing children cases and needed her expertise. Elena drove to the FBI field office in Houston, where Agent Linda Walsh was waiting with files spread across a conference table. The photos showed locations from across the country where children had vanished, but what caught Elena's attention were the energy readings and satellite data that had been collected from each site. "We have 12 missing children from 8 different states," Agent Walsh explained. "All disappeared within a 6-hour window yesterday evening. All taken from secure locations with no signs of forced entry or struggle. But look at this." Agent Walsh showed Elena the satellite images from each location taken just hours before the children disappeared. In every image, there were strange distortions in the atmosphere directly above where the children had been. The distortions looked like heat waves, but the weather data showed normal temperatures and no atmospheric conditions that should have caused such effects. Elena studied the energy signatures more closely. She had seen readings like this before in theoretical papers about advanced propulsion systems, but never in real-world data. The energy patterns were consistent with something that could bend space around itself, creating exactly the kind of atmospheric disturbances shown in the satellite photos. "Agent Walsh," Elena said slowly, "I think you need to contact the Pentagon. These readings suggest technology far beyond anything we have on Earth." 2 days later, President Harrison sat in the Situation Room beneath the White House, surrounded by his top advisors and military officials. General Patrick Stone stood at the front of the room, pointing to a large screen that showed the satellite data Elena had analyzed. "Madam President, we believe 12 American children have been taken by an unknown aircraft using advanced technology that we do not currently possess," General Stone said. "The energy signatures are consistent with theoretical propulsion systems that would require scientific knowledge decades ahead of our current capabilities." Secretary of Defense Catherine Blake leaned forward in her chair. "General, are you telling me that these children were taken by aliens?" The room fell silent. The word that nobody had wanted to say was now hanging in the air. President Harrison looked around the table at the faces of her advisors, seeing the same mixture of disbelief and growing anger that she felt. "What evidence do we have that this aircraft is still in our solar system?" President Harrison asked. Dr. Alex Mitchell, who had been called in from MIT to analyze the energy data, cleared his throat nervously. "Madam President, the propulsion system that created these signatures would leave a trail that our deep space monitoring systems could track. We have been analyzing the data, and we believe the craft is moving slowly toward the outer edge of our solar system." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward with additional reports. "The energy trail is still detectable. Whatever took these children is massive, much larger than any aircraft we have ever built. It is moving at a speed that suggests they are not trying to leave our solar system quickly, which might mean they intend to study their cargo before departing." President Harrison felt a cold anger settling in her chest. 12 children, including 2 siblings from the same family, had been taken from their homes and backyards by something from beyond Earth. The parents of these children were going through a nightmare that no parent should ever have to experience. "I want every resource we have focused on tracking this craft and determining its intentions," President Harrison said. "Contact our allies and inform them of the situation. If these children are still alive, we are going to get them back." Meanwhile, aboard the Zephyrian research vessel, the situation was becoming more complicated. Ben Cooper's condition had worsened significantly. The small boy was barely conscious, his body unable to adapt to the alien environment and the stress of captivity. The other children could see his suffering, and their distress calls had become more frequent and more urgent. Jake Martinez had established communication with several of the other children by creating simple hand signals. They could see through their energy barriers. He had worked out a system where they took turns comforting Ben by singing to him, even though they could not touch him or get close enough to really help. Katie Adams had figured out the timing of the alien visits and had begun trying to communicate with their captors by pointing to Ben and making gestures that she hoped would convey that he needed medical help. The aliens observed her behavior and noted it as increased agitation consistent with pack stress responses. Dr. Veltana watched the children's emotional readings with growing interest. Instead of the despair and resignation that typically set in with captured specimens after several days, these creatures were showing increased determination and what could only be described as anger. The readings were unlike anything in their extensive database of species studies. Young Danny Kim had continued his careful observation of the energy barriers, and he was becoming more convinced that the power system had a weakness he might be able to exploit. He began teaching the other children subtle ways to test the barriers without alerting their captors, disguising his experiments as the kind of restless movements that captured animals typically displayed. Amy Chen had expanded her communication system with the other children, creating complex rhythms that allowed them to share information about their captors' schedules and behaviors. The aliens recorded this as increased territorial marking, not understanding that the children were actually gathering intelligence about their situation. The Zephyrians prepared their preliminary report for transmission to their homeworld, describing the specimens as more behaviorally complex than initially assessed, and recommending extended study. They had no idea that far below them, on the small blue planet they had visited, the most powerful military force their species had ever encountered was beginning to mobilize for war. The news spread across Earth like wildfire. Within hours of President Harrison's emergency broadcast, every television channel and internet site was carrying the same impossible story. 12 American children had been taken by aliens, and the United States government was asking for international cooperation to bring them home. In Moscow, President Volkov canceled his scheduled meetings and called an emergency session of his military advisors. In Beijing, Chairman Li ordered the immediate sharing of all Chinese space monitoring data with American officials. In London, Prime Minister Davies announced that Britain would provide any assistance needed to rescue the children. For the first time in human history, the world's nations put aside their differences completely. The phrase, "they took our children," became a rallying cry that crossed every border, every language, and every political divide. Russian scientists worked alongside American engineers. Chinese military experts shared intelligence with European space agencies. Israeli defense contractors opened their most classified research to international teams. Dr. Alex Mitchell had not slept in 3 days. His laboratory at MIT had become the center of the most important scientific project in human history. Teams of physicists, engineers, and military experts from around the world worked around the clock to understand the alien technology and figure out how to track the ship that had taken the children. The breakthrough came when Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo University combined her research on quantum field distortions with the energy signatures Elena Rodriguez had identified. They discovered that the alien propulsion system left a unique trail in space-time itself, a trail that could be followed using modified deep space telescopes. "We have them," Dr. Mitchell announced to the Joint Command Center that had been established at NORAD. "The alien vessel is currently located near Jupiter's orbit, moving slowly toward the outer edge of our solar system, based on their current speed. We estimate they will leave our solar system in approximately 6 days." Admiral Lisa Parker stood before a wall-sized display showing the positions of every spacecraft Earth could deploy. She had been given command of humanity's first interstellar military operation, and the weight of 12 young lives rested on her shoulders. The fleet she commanded was a mix of military satellites, experimental spacecraft, and civilian rockets that had been hastily retrofitted with weapons based on the alien energy signatures. "We have one chance at this," Admiral Parker told the assembled commanders from every major nation. "Our ships are not designed for this kind of mission, and we are facing technology we do not fully understand. But we have something they do not expect. We are not fighting for territory or resources. We are fighting for our children." Captain Danny Brooks, piloting the lead fighter in what had been designated Strike Group Alpha, ran through his final equipment checks. His spacecraft had originally been designed for satellite repair missions, but it was now equipped with experimental energy weapons that Dr. Mitchell's team had developed based on their analysis of the alien propulsion system. "All units, this is Admiral Parker," came the voice over the communication system. "We are approaching the target vessel. Remember, our primary objective is the safe recovery of the children. We engage only if they refuse to return them peacefully." Back on the alien ship, the situation with the human children had become critical. Ben Cooper was barely breathing, his small body failing to adapt to the alien environment. The other children had become increasingly desperate in their attempts to get help for him. But the Zephyrians continued to view his deterioration as valuable research data rather than a medical emergency. Jake Martinez had reached a breaking point. The 12-year-old had watched Ben getting sicker for days while their captors did nothing but take measurements and recordings. Jake had tried everything he could think of to get the alien's attention, from making loud noises to trying to break his energy barrier. but nothing had worked. That morning, Jake did something that would later be studied by military psychologists and alien behavior experts across the galaxy. He positioned himself directly in front of the main observation camera in his cage and looked straight into it with a calmness that was terrifying in someone so young. "You are hurting us on purpose now," Jake said clearly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "That is not science. That is being cruel. And when our parents come for us, and they will come, you are going to learn why that was the biggest mistake you could ever make." Dr. Veltana, who was monitoring the emotional readings from the observation deck, watched her instruments spike to levels she had never seen before. The human child was not showing the despair or resignation that captured specimens typically displayed. Instead, he was showing something that the Zephyrian language did not even have a word for. The closest translation would be righteous fury, but even that did not capture the intensity of what her instruments were detecting. "This is most unusual," Dr. Veltana reported to Captain Mordak. "The largest specimen is displaying emotional patterns that suggest absolute certainty of rescue. This is unprecedented in our research records." Captain Mordak reviewed the data from his command station. "Perhaps the specimen has become delusional due to stress. This is not uncommon in primitive species when removed from their natural environment." "Sir, I do not believe this is delusion," Dr. Veltana replied. "The brain scans show clear logical thought patterns. The specimen appears to genuinely believe that others of his species will locate this vessel and attempt to retrieve him and the other specimens." Kethavar joined the conversation from his laboratory. "The specimens continue to display behaviors that contradict our classification of them as primitive creatures. Their social organization has become more sophisticated, not less, during their captivity. They have developed complex communication methods, established leadership hierarchies, and maintain what can only be described as military discipline. In the holding chamber, the children had indeed organized themselves in ways that amazed even their clinical observers. Katie Adams had become the group's caretaker, using songs and stories to keep the younger children calm. Amy Chen had established watch schedules, so that someone was always monitoring their captors' movements. Danny Kim had continued his careful study of the energy barriers, and had shared his observations with the other children using the hand signal system Jake had created. Lucy Martinez, despite being only 7 years old, had shown tactical thinking that impressed even the aliens. She had figured out how to hide food and water from the daily rations, creating secret supplies that could be used if their captors decided to reduce their feeding schedule. The aliens recorded all of these behaviors in their scientific logs, but they continued to interpret them through the lens of animal behavior, rather than recognizing them as evidence of intelligence and planning capability. To the Zephyrians, the children were simply well-organized pack animals, not young members of a species capable of complex reasoning and strategic thinking. Warning alarms suddenly began sounding throughout the alien ship. Captain Mordak rushed to his command station and activated the external sensors. What he saw on the display screens filled him with confusion and concern. Dozens of small spacecraft were approaching his vessel, all broadcasting signals on communication frequencies that the ship's computers were struggling to translate. "Unknown vessels. This is Captain Mordak of the Zephyrian research vessel Crimson Dawn," he transmitted. "You are interfering with a scientific mission. Identify yourselves and state your intentions." The response came immediately from Admiral Parker aboard the flagship Earth's Fury. "This is the Earth Defense Fleet. You are holding 12 human children aboard your vessel. We demand their immediate and safe return." Captain Mordak was genuinely puzzled. "The juvenile specimens are part of an ongoing preservation study. We cannot comprehend your concern for these underdeveloped members of your species." Admiral Parker's voice carried a coldness that made even the emotionless Zephyrians take notice. "You have our children. Return them now or we will take them back by force." In the holding chamber below, Jake Martinez heard the alarms and felt something he had not felt since his captivity began. Hope. Real, solid hope that burned in his chest like a warm fire. He looked at his sister Lucy and saw the same hope beginning to grow in her eyes. "I told you," Jake whispered to the observation camera, his young voice carrying a promise that would soon reshape how every alien species in the galaxy viewed humanity. "I told you they would come." The human fleet spread out across space like angry wasps surrounding a giant. Admiral Lisa Parker stood on the bridge of Earth's Fury, watching the alien vessel through the main display screen. The Zephyrian ship was enormous, easily 10 times larger than her entire fleet combined. But size had never stopped humans from fighting when their children were in danger. Captain Danny Brooks positioned his fighter squadron around the alien ship's lower section, while Russian pilot Major Alexei Petrov led his team to cover the upper areas. Chinese Admiral Chen Wei commanded the missile platforms that had been hastily converted from cargo ships, and British Commander Sarah Williams coordinated the electronic warfare units that would attempt to disable the alien ship's systems. All units, maintain position and await my orders, Admiral Parker broadcast to the fleet. We give them one more chance to return our children peacefully. On the alien ship, Captain Mordak studied the tactical display with growing concern. The human ships were small and appeared to use primitive propulsion systems, but there were many of them, and they had positioned themselves in a coordinated formation that suggested military training. More troubling was the energy signatures his sensors were detecting from their weapon systems. Their weapons appeared to be based on modified versions of our own propulsion technology, reported Chief Science Officer Kethvar. This should be impossible. These creatures should not have the scientific knowledge to understand our systems, much less adapt them for military purposes. Dr. Veltana joined them on the command deck, her instruments still monitoring the emotional states of the human children in the holding chambers below. Captain, the specimens are showing extreme excitement. Their emotional readings suggest they believe rescue is imminent. How could primitive creatures possibly know about the approaching vessels? Captain Mordak asked. Sir, I do not believe these creatures are as primitive as we initially assessed, Dr. Veltana replied. Their behavior patterns suggest intelligence levels that may approach or exceed our own. Captain Mordak activated the main communication system and broadcast to the human fleet. This is Captain Mordak. We are scientists conducting preservation research. The juvenile specimens you refer to as children are valuable subjects in our study of your species. We cannot release them. Admiral Parker's response came immediately, and her voice carried the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. Those children have names. They have families who love them. They are not specimens or subjects. They are human beings, and you will return them now. The alien captain genuinely did not understand the human response. In Zephyrian society, the young were cared for by the community until they reached maturity, but individual attachment between specific adults and specific juveniles was minimal. The concept that adult humans would risk their lives to save juveniles they had never met was completely foreign to him. We do not comprehend your emotional attachment to these specimens, Captain Mordak transmitted. They are simply underdeveloped members of your species. Why do you value them so highly? Colonel Steve Morrison, commanding one of the assault squadrons, responded before Admiral Parker could stop him. His voice shook with barely controlled rage. You caged human children. Do you even realize, my God, what have you done? The silence that followed stretched across space like a held breath. Every human in the fleet understood exactly what Colonel Morrison meant. They had all seen the images transmitted from the alien ship during the first communication attempt. 12 terrified children, locked in energy cages like animals, with little Ben Cooper barely conscious in Katie's arms. Captain Mordak made a fatal error in judgment, believing that displaying the specimens would demonstrate their value and convince the humans to leave. He activated the external cameras and broadcast live images of the children in their cages directly to the human fleet. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every human who saw those images felt something deep in their evolutionary programming trigger. It was not just anger or outrage. It was the same protective fury that had allowed their species to survive ice ages, predators, and countless other threats by ensuring that no matter what happened, the children would be protected. Admiral Parker watched her tactical displays as the emotional state of her entire fleet shifted from professional military discipline to something far more dangerous. She could hear it in the radio chatter, see it in the way her ships began moving into attack positions without waiting for orders, feel it in her own chest like a fire that demanded immediate action. You made a mistake, Admiral Parker transmitted to the alien ship, her voice now carrying the cold precision of absolute commitment. You showed us our children in cages. You showed us Ben Cooper dying while you do nothing to help him. You showed us Katie Adams singing to herself because she is scared and alone. You showed us Jake Martinez trying to protect his little sister with nothing but his own small body. Captain Danny Brooks could not contain himself any longer. You want to study humans? He broadcast on all frequencies. Here is your first lesson. We are the species that will burn down the entire universe to protect our young. We are the species that turns our deepest love into our most terrible weapon. And you just gave us a reason to show you exactly what that means. The human fleet moved as one organism, every ship positioning itself for maximum tactical advantage. Admiral Parker had planned for this moment, knowing that once her people saw the children, there would be no negotiation, no compromise, and no retreat. Captain Mordak finally began to understand the magnitude of his error. The human ships were not randomly positioned around his vessel. They had created overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. Their weapons were locked onto critical systems with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of Zephyrian ship design. How do they know our ship's weaknesses? He asked Kethvar desperately. Sir, they have been analyzing our energy signatures since we first visited their planet, the science officer replied. They have had days to study our propulsion system and identify vulnerabilities. These creatures learn and adapt at a speed I have never encountered in any species. In the holding chamber, Jake Martinez felt the ship shudder as the first human weapon struck the alien vessel's shields. He gathered the other children around him, speaking in the calm voice of someone far older than his 12 years. Listen to me, Jake told them. Our people are here. Our parents and our soldiers and everyone who loves us is fighting to get us back. Katie, keep singing to Ben. Amy, help Lucy stay calm. Danny, get ready to move when I tell you. We are going to get out of here. The children positioned themselves exactly as Jake instructed, showing the kind of discipline and coordination that should have been impossible for beings their age. The aliens watching from above finally began to understand that they had not captured primitive animals. They had kidnapped the young of a species capable of military strategy, tactical thinking, and something the Zephyrians had never encountered in all their research. Absolute, uncompromising love for their children. Dr. Veltana watched her emotional monitoring equipment overload as the human children's readings spiked beyond anything in her database. Captain, the specimens are not showing fear. They are showing anticipation, and what I can only describe as complete confidence in their rescue. Captain, Mordak stared at the tactical display as human ships systematically began dismantling his vessel's defenses. These small, primitive creatures had somehow learned to build weapons that could threaten a ship, thousands of years more advanced than their own technology. They had organized themselves into a coordinated military force in a matter of days. And they had done all of this for 12 small members of their species who were not even related to most of them. What kind of species are we dealing with? He whispered. The answer came from Jake Martinez, speaking clearly into the observation camera as explosions rocked the ship around them. You are dealing with humans, and you took our children. Now you get to learn what that means. The battle that followed would be remembered across the galaxy as the Sol incident, the day humanity announced itself to the universe in the most terrifying way possible. Admiral Parker's fleet moved with precision that amazed even the advanced Zephyrians, every ship working together like parts of a single deadly organism. Captain Danny Brooks led his fighter squadron in a coordinated strike against the alien ship's weapon systems, while Major Alexei Petrov's team targeted their shield generators. Chinese Admiral Chen Wei's converted cargo ships launched waves of missiles that had been designed using the alien energy signatures, and British Commander Sarah Williams's electronic warfare units began jamming the Zephyrian communication systems. The human attack was not random or desperate. It was calculated, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of the alien technology had revealed every weakness in their ship design, and Admiral Parker was exploiting each one with surgical precision. On the alien ship, Captain Mordak watched his defenses crumble with growing horror. The human weapons were crude compared to Zephyrian technology, but they had been specifically designed to target the exact frequencies and energy patterns that his ship used. It was like watching primitive spears that had been perfectly crafted to penetrate advanced armor. Their tactical coordination is impossible, Chief Science Officer Kethvar reported from his damaged station. They are using communication methods and battle strategies that should require decades of joint training. How are they achieving this level of coordination? The answer lay in something the Zephyrians had never encountered in their thousands of years of research. Humanity's ability to unite completely when their children were threatened transcended every barrier of language, culture, and nationality. Russian pilots were following orders from American commanders without question. Chinese weapons officers were taking targeting data from British intelligence units without hesitation. The entire human fleet operated as one mind with one purpose. In the holding chamber, Jake Martinez felt the ship shaking as human weapons found their targets. He had positioned the other children exactly where he wanted them, using the tactical thinking that the aliens had observed but never understood. When the ship's power fluctuated during a particularly heavy barrage, Jake was ready. "Now, Danny," Jake called out as the energy barriers flickered. Danny Kim had been studying the power systems for days, and he knew exactly when the barriers would be weakest. As the ship's main power grid struggled to maintain shields against the human attack, Danny pressed his small hand against the lower left corner of his energy cage, right where he had calculated the field would be thinnest. The barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking glass. Danny tumbled out of his cage and immediately ran to the control panel he had been watching the aliens use. His fingers moved across the alien controls with the confidence of a child who had turned this into the ultimate puzzle game. One by one, the other energy cages shut down. Katie Adams was the first to reach Ben Cooper, gathering the sick boy in her arms and checking his breathing. Amy Chen helped Lucy Martinez out of her cage, while Jake coordinated the other children with hand signals he had taught them during their captivity. Dr. Veltana, monitoring from the observation deck, watched in shock as her instruments registered what the human children were doing. "Captain, the specimens have escaped containment and are moving through the ship with apparent knowledge of our systems. This should be impossible." "Everything about these creatures is impossible," Captain Mordak replied as another explosion rocked his ship. "Send security teams to recapture them." But the Zephyrian security teams found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. The human children moved through the ship like a military unit, with Jake Martinez directing them using the same tactical principles that Admiral Parker was employing with the fleet outside. They avoided the security teams, used the ship's own layout against their pursuers, and demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that left the aliens completely unprepared. 10-year-old Katie Adams carried Ben Cooper through corridors she had memorized by watching the aliens' movements, while Amy Chen and Lucy Martinez served as scouts, using the alien communication systems they had learned to understand during their captivity. Danny Kim had somehow figured out how to access the ship's internal maps, and he guided them toward what he believed was the docking bay. The Zephyrian security forces found themselves chasing opponents who anticipated their every move, avoided their traps, and seemed to understand their ship better than they did. The children had spent days observing their captors while the aliens had dismissed their intelligence as primitive animal behavior. Admiral Parker's voice came over the alien ship's communication system as her fleet completed the systematic destruction of their defenses. "Captain Mordak, your shields are down, your weapons are disabled, and your propulsion system is offline. Surrender now and we will consider allowing your crew to survive this encounter." Captain Mordak looked at his tactical display and realized that his massive, technologically superior vessel had been completely defeated by creatures he had considered primitive animals. The human ships surrounded him like hunters who had brought down prey many times their own size. "Admiral Parker," Captain Mordak transmitted, his voice carrying a desperation that no Zephyrian had ever felt before. "We had no understanding of your species' social bonds. We believed we were conducting standard preservation research. We meant no harm to your offspring." Admiral Parker's response became the message that spread across every inhabited world in the galaxy. "You took our children. You caged them like animals. You watched them suffer and called it science. You may not have intended harm, but you caused it. And now every species in this galaxy is going to learn what happens when you threaten human children." The human fleet moved in for the final phase of their operation. Boarding parties led by Colonel Morrison and Major Petrov docked with the alien vessel using equipment that had been hastily modified from space station connectors. The humans moved through the alien ship with the same coordinated precision their fleet had shown in battle. They found the children in the ship's central corridor, with Jake Martinez holding his sister Lucy, while Katie Adams carried Ben Cooper. The reunion between the human soldiers and the rescued children was broadcast live to Earth, and the images of Colonel Morrison kneeling down to speak quietly with Jake Martinez became symbols of humanity's greatest victory. Ben Cooper was rushed to the human medical bay that had been set up on one of the fleet's ships, where Dr. Sarah Kim worked frantically to stabilize his condition. The other children were examined and treated for the effects of their captivity, but physically they had survived their ordeal remarkably well. 6 months later, Ambassador Carol Weber stood before the first Galactic Council that included humanity as a member species. The footage of the Sol incident had been transmitted to every known civilization, and humanity's reputation had changed overnight from unknown primitives to the most dangerous species in known space. Jake Martinez, now 13 and recovering from the psychological trauma of his experience, served as humanity's youngest advisor on the new galactic child protection protocols that became mandatory across all civilized worlds. His testimony to the council was simple and direct. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy," Jake said, his young voice carrying across the vast assembly hall. "We are not the smartest or the most advanced or the most peaceful. But we are the only species that will destroy everything and everyone to protect our children. Remember that when you meet humans. Remember that when you see our ships. Remember that when you think about what we will do if you ever threaten our young again." The Zephyrians, now imprisoned on Earth as subjects of the same kind of research they had conducted on others, spent their days trying to understand what their scientists called the human paradox. How could a species be simultaneously so nurturing toward their offspring and so utterly destructive when those offspring were threatened? Captain Mordak, in his cell at the International Detention Facility, continued to study the data from his encounter with humanity. He had finally understood that the creatures he had captured were not primitive animals, but the juvenile form of the most dangerous predator the galaxy had ever produced. In the depths of space, alien civilizations updated their star charts with new warnings about the Sol system. Trade routes were redirected to avoid Earth's expanding sphere of influence. Military commanders developed new protocols for any encounters with human vessels. The message was simple and clear, transmitted across the galaxy in 1,000 different languages, but meaning the same thing everywhere. Avoid the Sol system. Do not approach human colonies. Never, under any circumstances, touch their children. Ben Cooper recovered fully from his ordeal and grew up to become Earth's first interstellar diplomat, carrying humanity's message to new worlds with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the unthinkable. Katie Adams became a xenobiologist, dedicated to understanding alien species so that future misunderstandings could be avoided. But it was Jake Martinez who became the symbol of humanity's awakening to its place in the galaxy. The 12-year-old boy who had stared into an alien